remember that conversation. So, good afternoon, Tina Madison White.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
I am well. We're beginning a new process in our interview oral history project that involves remote recording. So, again, your patience is appreciated as we work through this process. And thank you very much for volunteering your time and telling your stories for this effort.
Oh, you're welcome.
There are a couple things that are formalities, if you will, but there's a text that I need to read to you, and if you don't mind, I'll go through that now.
Sure.
So, again, thank you for sharing your time and the gifts of your stories. We can take a break or end the interview at any point. My name is Rachel Muir, and I'm working with Blue Ridge Pride, YMCA, and Amanda Ray to record oral histories from elders and members of the LGBTQ community and allies. With your permission, all stories will be archived with special collections at UNC Asheville and available as audio, video, typed transcript files. You will be contacted to review your typed transcripts in advance of publication in case you wish to make changes, corrections, or name restrictions. I have an oral history release form for you to sign. You should have received that by email already. That gives your oral history and other materials you have to special collections. With restrictions means you wish to restrict some information, such as part of your interview, your name, withholding the interview until a certain date, for example. Without restrictions means that we can publish your name and story as stated once you've approved the final transcript. And that will be signed. That signed form will be given to Amanda Ray, who is coordinating our project. Any questions on that basic information?
No. How do I get the form to you?
We need a signed copy of the form. Mail it, please.
Okay.
So make a signed copy of the form, make a copy for yourself, and I will forward the copy to Amanda Ray and UNC Asheville.
Yeah, I saw I can't get out to mailboxes very easily. I saw can I just email it to you if I send you the PDF?
Well, we want a signature on it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'll take a picture and send you that.
So as a PDF, you can.
Okay, great.
So that works as well. We just need to have your signature. And of course, if it's just, that's why in some ways a preference is to have a physical copy in our hands.
Okay.
But we're versatile in that respect.
Okay.
Okay, that was the pro forma portion of the interview. Let me start with the introduction. Today's date is August 20th, 2020. My name is Rachel Muir. I'm a volunteer for this project. I'm talking with Tina White, who was born in what year?
1958.
In what city, state, or county?
I was born in New York, New York, in Hell's Kitchen.
Oh my. Your preferred pronouns are?
She, her, hers.
And you've been living in this area for how long?
I've been living in Asheville for about 5 years.
Okay. Well, that ends our preliminary information. We're going to go on to the questions. And let me emphasize again, this is your interview. At any time, if you want to depart or enrich one particular portion of the story, please do so. That's what makes this your interview and not a cookie cutter version of what we want to record. And I'll be taking notes along the way.
Okay.
So how would you describe yourself, Tina?
Ooh, a middle-aged, a woman of a certain age. I'm married. I retired technically, but I'm probably busier than I was when I was in my corporate career. I used to consult to large-scale corporations, and now I'm really full-time working as an activist, a volunteer activist for different organizations.
In regards to gender, race, socioeconomics, any?
Well, I would describe myself as transgender. I fully own that. It isn't I think of myself as a human being who happens to be transgender. Um, I'm white, um, and grew up with a kind of a privileged middle class, upper middle class background. My parents were, my mother was a professor and my father a minister. Um, I went to business school, so I have a graduate degree. Um, and what were there any other identity labels you were looking for?
No, that pretty much covers our basic. If there's anything you'd like to add.
No, that's
Okay. Well, what brought you to Western North Carolina and how long have you been here?
uh, my wife and I moved here in 2016. Uh, I had been living in New York City and decided that I wanted to retire and really spend the balance of my life paying it forward and becoming an activist. And at the time, I was hearing how horrible things were for transgender people in the South. So I decided to move to the South. I picked Asheville because I wanted to live in a city that did feel welcoming and safe, and Asheville is certainly that. So we moved down here, and as we were driving in our U-Haul, we actually learned the announcement that day of the passage of this bill called HB2, and that certainly accelerated my immersion into activism in the South.
Exquisite timing.
Yes.
Since you arrived here, what things have changed in positive ways from your perspective?
In the South or for me, I'm not sure I understand.
Both for you and also in the community that you now reside in.
Well, HB2 it's not completely gone, but it's certainly better than it was when I arrived. I don't know whether I'd say things have gotten better. I'm glad I moved here. Mary and I love Asheville. I think it's more they're different. When I arrived here, there was a big focus on the bathroom bill, on transgender rights. That issue remains, but there's a much bigger focus, as you know, on racial equity and inclusion. And I've been shifting more of my attention to that front.
Intersectionality type of questions, issues?
I'm not sure, what do you mean?
Intersectionality, the idea of people who have multiple identities that include racial, gender issues in which, because of those multiple identities, they're particularly subject to discrimination.
Well, it's not intersectionality for me because I'm white. So I'm not, I know what you're asking. And I think intersectionality it's a useful term, but it suffers the same limitations of the labels that it tries to mingle together. I think in the end, each of us is a very individual human being, and you can describe us as the intersection of lots of labels, or you can describe us as something greater than any of those labels. And I think more that second way. To describe myself as the intersection of something is to actually allow myself to be colonized, not by one label, but by many labels. And I prefer to think that I'm Tina Madison White, thank you. And if you'd like to get to know me, I'm happy to tell you anything you want to know. And I think intersectionality is a useful tool socially and politically because you have to address these broad social issues, and I think it's useful there. But at individual level, I like to leave that aside because I don't want to label anyone, even if, and a good example is gender. I consider myself female, I identify as female. I understand on Facebook there are now over 50 different pronouns that they offer as choices. And that's fine. I'm not sure that any one pronoun would ever capture how I feel about me, and whether my definition of what the pronoun she means is probably very different from what someone else means. So again, in the end, I prefer just to focus on the limitations of any labels at really capturing a true person, and we should not discriminate against people based on any label, because it doesn't treat them as an individual. It reduces them to a class. And I think that's kind of the original sin of language.
Now, have there been things, one of our questions is, have you seen things that have changed in a negative fashion? And that, I think, applies both to in Asheville, our immediate community, because that's our principal interest, but that doesn't exclude national issues that you certainly will affect us locally and across the country. So are there things or trends or actions that have changed your view about your status, if you will, as an LGBTQ person since you've arrived in Nashville?
Well, I feel very fortunate. Personally, I've been welcomed by the community, particularly the allied community. I really have been broadly welcomed. I feel very comfortable going out and about within Asheville. If I travel 15 miles outside of Asheville, I'm a little bit more cautious. Certainly for the country, we've had just a horrible 4 years. And it's not, I'm trying to stay away from politics or partisan politics. I think we just accept lying. We accept as sources of information as a country, things that we would never allow in our house. I mean, if someone in my family lied to me as often as we're lied to on TV, I wouldn't allow it. I feel that I certainly have experienced attacks from the religious right, for example, against transgender people. Balanced against that, I've also felt the embrace of a lot more people than I have before. And it's hard to say whether it's good or bad. It depends on where we are a few years from now. I think that a lot of the horrible things that have happened have brought out the better angels in a lot of people, and gotten a lot of people a lot more involved and concerned, and I'm very happy about that.
As you see changes, and this is a question that's particularly focused on Asheville in Western North Carolina, what would you like to see that would be positive? What kind of trends, what sort of changes do you think would make life better for members of this community?
I'd like to see, number one, this is at the state level, I'd like to see Raleigh changed and flipped so that we can have greater autonomy and an ability to pass laws and regulations that address a lot of the inequities and prejudices that still persist even here in Asheville. Absent that, I don't think we could get to the rest of my wish list. I'm excited that the city is doing a lot more on an equity basis. I think we need to continue to press for that. The proof will be in the pudding. I'm seeing with festivals, with events, with various public properties, a greater attention to equity-based funding of those events. I'm seeing some positive trends in school policies and things like that locally. I'd like to see more of that.
Okay. Those are sort of general questions. Now, the real focus is what we'd like to get to is your personal story. So let's begin at the beginning. Where did you grow up? And what was it like to grow up? How long did you live there?
I was born in New York, um, in the middle of Manhattan. Lived there for 5 years, and then moved to Chicago for 3 years, and then to Washington D.C., where from fourth grade on, that's where I grew up. Um, I generally had a pretty good childhood. Had lots of friends, had a big family. And I describe myself as generally happy, except for one thing. On gender, I was from an early age, around 6, I was very confused. I didn't feel comfortable identifying as a male. I had lots of male friends, but I felt a, a connection to women that I didn't feel with the guys. And I almost felt more like a girl playing with the guys than that I was a tomboy. Um, uh, um, and as I began to age, that confusion grew in intensity. And I'd say until I was 10, I was confused. We didn't have the vocabulary about gender back then, so it didn't even occur to me to think in terms of identity. But I would often, um, I just thought, well, identify with women. I hadn't gone to, oh, I identify as a woman, though I often did privately. And I would imagine, I'd read Nancy Drew and imagine myself as Nancy Drew or Pippi Longstocking. Pippi Longstocking was kind of my hero. I think because she was a girl, but she also bridged that distance with boys, and so that was an identity I could sort of inhabit. When I became a teenager, I got very confused, and I think that's because your hormones kick in, and I was very uncomfortable with the feelings that I had, very confused. Felt very conflicted socially. And it was at that point that I really started to consciously, but not willingly, put on a face. And the way I experienced it was that I was just trying to man up, and that if I kept doing that, eventually it would make sense. So I wasn't trying to fake it. But I did feel fake. And I felt the problem was me, that I just hadn't grown up enough, or that there was something in my family's past. And I spent the next 30 years trying every imaginable solution, prayer, and I tried lots of different denominations and congregations, would read different religious writers. I read a lot of psychological texts and medical texts, just looking for something that would explain this. And I was determined that I would conquer my gender, and that I'd actually become famous, because well, at first, actually, until the internet came, I thought I was the only person in the world who felt this way. I mean, I really thought I'm just a freak, and didn't dare to talk to anyone. My family had no idea. But when the internet arrived, and there was sort of every year a little bit more and more news, I began to realize that a lot of people were struggling with this. And that's when I started to say, well, I'm going to conquer this, and then I will write a book, and I'll be famous, and I'll help lots of people. And as you can see, that didn't work.
Well, I think it did, actually. But was there in growing up, and this is sort of a two-part question, what's your happiest memory? And then is there a memory specifically about LGBTQ identity, or an aha moment that you'd like to recall?
Um, I think my happiest memory, it's a funny one. It was when I was very young, and it was just, I was walking, uh, I was in church with my father, who was the minister of that church. It was, he was the minister to a Black and Hispanic congregation in Hell's Kitchen, New York. And I just remember one day just walking down the aisle with him, and I was holding his finger. And when you're little, there's just like nothing more powerful. It was almost godlike, where I'm just holding on to that. And we, he walked me to the front. I think he'd gone to retrieve me because I was talking. I think I'd been saying I want my daddy. And he just came and got me blushing and brought me up front and continued preaching. And I was just beaming at the audience, holding on to his finger. And I never felt safer or just sort of more at the center of a universe. That's probably, I mean, I had lots of other neat moments, but I just remember that moment like magic. And I mention that because one of the theories that people often have, and certainly had when I was working through all this, was that, oh, you don't have a good relationship with your parents, or you didn't with your father, he wasn't there as a figure, or your mother did something, you were closer to her. And that was never true. I didn't identify with my father's gender. And in fact, now, he and I talk about this, now that I'm Tina, it's actually given me a solid foundation. And so now he and I have grown much closer, and I identify with him more strongly because now I have my own identity and to connect to. And I think something that people don't understand is if you deny someone their identity, you're denying them their core. And my father would say that today I do far more good for society than I did as Tom. And he loved Tom. He loved me as Tom. But he can just tell I have conviction that I never had before. I have energy that I never had before. I have empathy that I never had before. And if you feel hollow inside, it's very hard to offer other people empathy or offer them yourself. And I don't really care. You asked me way at the beginning of this what my preferred pronouns are. I almost don't care. I want them respected. But what I care is that I have my own identity and I own it. No one else does. And it's the most precious gift I've been given. And now I try to think about what good do I do with that? Whatever, label me any way you want, but let me go do the works I'm supposed to do.
Did your experience as a trans person when you were young, do you have a sense that it created energy for you to do other things? Did it create an internal motivation to try and tackle the world? You mentioned earlier that you wanted to write that book and change people's lives. Did that experience that you had growing up, do you feel like it propelled you or it held you back?
Oh, it definitely did not propel me, or it certainly did not propel me in a good direction. I was transphobic. I was as transphobic as the rest of the world. And so something that I don't share with today's younger generation, they can point their finger and say, world, you're not letting me be who I am. I never let anyone in the world know who I was because I was terrified of who I was. So I was my own worst enemy. Now, if I'd come out, I would have had a very different energy propelling me. But all of my energy was bent on denial and on what I would have described then as fixing myself. It wasn't fixing myself. It was actually trying to suffocate and silence myself. It was just filled with shame for no reason that I could understood, because I always felt like I was a good person. The only thing I could say positive about it, and this is stretching, I think I tried extra hard to be a good person, to be a kind person, to be compassionate. because I was walking around with a very deep wound, and I quickly empathized with people who seemed to be in pain. But that said, I lacked the confidence and the energy to do anything about that. It's why I think I went into consulting, because I could advise you. And that's very different from being an entrepreneur, an owner. I wasn't ready to own things. I was renting my own life. And now I feel like I own my life. And that's the big difference. I own my life now. And so I'm invested in it. When you're a renter, you're not invested in something. You may clean it, you may still be a good neighbor, but you're not invested in your life if you feel like you're just renting it.
Along the line, was there any particular organization within a community or at any level, national or the otherwise, that helped you in that journey?
Oh, yes. There are a lot of good organizations, but in my case, it was Human Rights Campaign. Happened to be there right at the moment when I needed them. I was working for Pfizer, very large organization. I was terrified of coming out. At the time, I'd not been aware of anyone else who had ever come out there. I subsequently learned that someone had a few years before, and it hadn't worked out well. But I was afraid to even call. I was afraid to even search on our intranet to see what our benefits might be, because I was worried that the thought police would see, oh, someone used the word transgender on our intranet. And my company actually was the one who turned to HRC. It wasn't me. It was Pfizer, because they wanted a third party to advise them on how to handle this. I think they did that more out of a need for safety, that they could point and say, we turned to a reputable third party, so you can't blame us, because they didn't know how it was going to turn out. And HRC was great. They in the first place, they set benchmarks with the Corporate Equality Index for my company on what policy should look like, and they discovered that their policies weren't there. They provided training or orientation, I think would be the better word, for my colleagues who are interested in just attending a Trans 101. And that was huge. And that's why I remain very involved with HRC. I'm just forever grateful for what they did and what they continue to do for a lot of people.
In the process of coming out, Tina, did you have a support group, sort of a place where you could, say, a smaller group that you could talk to and talk about your experiences and share experiences?
I did. It was in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, at the LGBTQ Center on, I think, 13th Street. Initially it was once a week and later once a month, owing to funding cuts. There was a group of transgender people that would gather there. It was often 50 people in a room, just crammed in a circle. I was an outlier in that by far the majority of people were Black and Hispanic. The few other whites that were there were from working class or homeless backgrounds. So I kind of stuck out as the only, certainly, corporate executive, except maybe one or two meetings, who was there, but that wasn't an issue for them at all. And there's nothing like being in a room with 50 of you and to talk about very deep feelings. It allows you for the first time to see both when I walked into my first meeting, and I don't know that I'm not ashamed, because it was an honest feeling, but when I first walked in, I looked around and my first thought that came to my mind was, I'm in a leper colony. And I mean, that really is it. And I winced just even hearing that, because my next thought was, and I've never felt so at home. And they were lovely people, loving people. And I just got them right away. I felt connected in spite of all our other sociological differences. I felt at home in a way that I'd never felt in my life. And I think those kinds of group sessions are just critical. It allows you both to feel support. And then it also allows you, as I started to do, was to individuate and say, oh, okay, well, I'm like them, but I'm also, here's what's different about me, or here's what's individual about me. And it was the first time I was able to explore my identity in a way that was helpful. Up until then, whenever I would think about my identity, all I thought about was, I don't belong, I don't belong. I didn't have, until I had that I belong, I couldn't say, oh, and here's what's different or neat or whatever about me. I just would, all I focused on was, I don't belong.
Wow. Do you feel like,
It's cool. Some of them are on pose now. So I see some
oh,
of the,
really?
yes, and it's so cool. But anyway, that's just my little, my 15th
Extraordinary.
fame.
When you arrived, this is a question that probably applies to mostly folks who are relatively recent arrivals here in Asheville. Do you feel like, in terms of your identity, you arrived fully formed when you got here to Asheville?
No. When my first marriage ended, I read this book. I don't recall the title, but it was based on a longitudinal study of divorced couples with children. And they followed them for 5 years, and then they learned so much from that. They followed them for 10 and then 15 and 20 years. And what was valuable about that was, by following them, they'd say, well, how did the children turn out? And how, what happened to them 5 years later, 10 years? And what about each of the parents? What made them tend to be better off or not? And one of the most singular conclusions they had, that one of the strongest, was that people who remarried without allowing for 3 to 5 years on their own in between had a very high redivorce rate. And the reason is that they didn't give themselves time to re-anchor themselves in their identity as a person. And I actually brought that forward to my transition and said, I need to be very careful about anything I say for the first 5 years, because the physical changes are easy by comparison. You explore a lot and you learn a lot about yourself. And I arrived at Asheville, I think 2 years after coming out. And I was always very public, but I did write in my book where I wrote my story. I felt that was okay, but I was very cautious about writing things about what it means to be transgender, or anything that was a broad social interpretation, because I just felt that it was my job just to listen and learn, and to accept my immaturity. And I don't mean that as a judgment. It's just it's where I was. I feel like I'm emerging from that now, and I'm finding my voice. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, he wrote about that when he left slavery, he was afraid to write or speak for the first 7 years. And this just blows my mind, because when he escaped from slavery, even within the free Black community, he was kind of considered very low level, because he'd been a slave, and they had, both whites and free Blacks had a very low opinion of freed slaves, that they hadn't been taught to think, that they were uneducated, they couldn't, just all these horrible things. And so he didn't feel he had a right to speak. And so when he finally published his autobiography, it's because he started to feel confident in his voice, and thank God he did. I'm not I'm no Frederick Douglass, but that really just meant a lot to me, and yeah, so I think and a mutual friend of ours, our author friend, helped me. I'm spacing out. You just gave me one of her books, Jennifer Jenny Boylan.
Jenny Boland.
Yeah. Um, she's the one who convinced me to start writing, and she wasn't talking to me, she was talking to an audience, but she said, even as she encourages to write her story, she said, but be careful what you say, because you're going to be learning a lot in your first few years, and you can hurt a lot of people if you just blather something that you haven't really thought through. You could hurt others in the community, and I think that's good advice, even today.
Yeah. Tina, were there personal relationships? Were there organizations when you got to Asheville that you found helpful or influenced you, have helped you to grow here in Western North Carolina?
There are quite a few. I happened to get involved with Blue Ridge Pride, but that was more an accident of circumstance. Their executive director at the time saw me, this new person, and just swooped me up and got me involved. And they had some crises, and I'd spent 35 years helping corporations with crises, and so I got very deeply involved in it, and I'm glad I did. So locally, I've worked a lot with them, but Campaign for Southern Equality, Transmission, NAACP are groups that I've gotten involved with. UNCA's Leadership Forum I've gotten very involved with, and that one I valued. I value getting involved with groups that aren't from my identity. I think that both are necessary, and that people need a group that they can sort of retreat to when they need care and feeding. But if we all did that, and that was my first concern when I moved to Asheville, was the LGBTQ community was so atomized into lots of different groups. Asheville Prime Timers, Gorgeous, Lesbians in the Mountains, Pink Pistols. Each of the colleges had a group, and that's fine, but what worried me was they weren't talking to each other, and they're often apart from society. So I've loved that more churches have started to either create programs or groups for LGBTQ community, or have been much more conscious about inviting them into other things. Yeah, so for me, I think I was also remained very involved in Human Rights Campaign, which consumed a lot of my time. I would have liked to have been more involved in some other local groups, but activism and learning is very time consuming. The one that I'm most excited about right now is I'm working with Aisha Adams, who runs the Asheville View and Equity Over Everything. And I'm learning so much from her and her organization. I had something recently where I was very excited. One of my roles is to conduct interviews of people in the community that we then, I guess you don't call it televising, but we air on the internet. And I was having lunch with a gentleman who had been in prison for 30 years and was struggling with reentry. And I was having lunch with them and their mentor, their sponsor. And we had this excited conversation about doing videotapes of them and really giving them much needed visibility in the community and raising this issue of the challenges of reentry and racial prejudice. And that night, the sponsor said, "Could I come by and visit you?" And I said, "Sure." And he came by and basically told me that he would appreciate it if I didn't conduct the interview because I'm trans. And he said that the person in question faces enough challenges, and to be interviewed by a trans person would just prejudice his friends and community against him, and he had enough challenges re-entering. And I understood it. I also felt very hurt and sad, but I still recognize that I have a lot of privilege. So I called Aisha and told her that, look, this is important, that you should have someone else interview him. And she just said, no. I said, but Aisha, this is important. And she said, yes, and we are here to help. We are here to help the community, but that doesn't mean that everyone's ready to be helped by us. And you are one of us. And when they're ready to be interviewed by you, we will stand there. And it was, I started to cry because when you park your identity like that, and I was willing to do it, but you're leaving a part of yourself, you're devaluing yourself. And I'm fortunate that I don't have to make that choice very often. And a lot of other people are constantly walking to rooms where they have to speak quietly, where they have to sit on their hands, let someone else speak. And I'm glad that I get the experience that very rarely. I was also glad to see what it felt like to have someone stand up for me. And it impressed to me the importance of us when I hear people say they don't understand Black Lives Matter and why do I need to get involved? We need to stand up for them. If Aisha had said, I'll do the interview, but I just want you to know that, I think that's wrong, I would have appreciated that, but I still would have walked into rooms being afraid.
Yeah.
And now I know if I walk into a room and Aisha's in that room, anyone who disrespects me better look out because she has my back. And I think we need to make sure that people who are minorities most of their lives, that they feel we have their back. And I think we've done a horrible job. I certainly have done a horrible job of that.
Are there elements of the LGBT community where when you arrived that you felt tensions, or that you feel that there are divisions and there's a healing process that needs to happen? And how do you think that can be addressed?
Oh, I think there are a lot of divisions within our community. And I think they were brought out in Asheville when I arrived because we were so comfortable. I think part of what has kept us together as a community for the past couple of decades is we had kind of a common enemy out there and we had to stand together. And in Asheville, in the heart of Asheville, that wasn't such a problem. I think we're generally accepted, certainly LGB. T and Q, I think, have had more of a challenge, particularly if they were transgender or queer people of color. But because people felt comfortable and accepted, they didn't feel the need to stand with each other. And I think, as I said earlier, when I arrived here, what struck me most about the LGBTQ community was how separate and suspicious various groups and factions were of each other. Some of the worst prejudice I've experienced in Nashville has come from people within our own community who pigeonholed me very quickly without knowing me as a person, which is part of why, as I said, I'm willing to own any label like transgender, transsexual. I'm happy to own those, but that's not how I want people to think that I'm someone who cares for my community. I care for you whether you're LGBTQ or not. And that and I value joining groups that don't necessarily identify as LGBTQ, because if I could only join LGBTQ groups, I would be saying that I can't be a complete person. And so I love spending, Mary and I often dine out with, there's sort of it's not strictly gay, or obviously we wouldn't be there, but 90% of the people who are there are gay gentlemen. I say gentlemen because most of them are over 45, probably well over 45. And it's just wonderful getting to know them, and knowing that I can feel safe and comfortable with them. The same thing with ventures with like the Leaf organization and other groups that are very welcoming, but that don't have any identity that officially connects to gender or sexuality. They just are welcoming. And I feel most at home in many ways with those groups. Part of that I recognize is because I'm privileged. So I'm able to enter those groups pretty quickly.
How do you think your privilege, as you said, gives you an entree into those groups?
I am very educated. I came from, I'm very degreed. I have a deep background in a lot of business issues, lots of skills that they value and experiences that they value that have nothing to do with my gender identity. And so it's just, I think people feel more quickly comfortable with me, because if you strip away the gender, almost everything else about me feels familiar to the power elite. I don't like that term, but the people who tend to be running the city tend to be white and educated, from a corporate background or a business background. And so we share a common language. And I don't think it's conscious. It just makes it, there's a lot that I could connect to them on where they go, oh, okay, I get Tina.
Tina, we're not even about halfway through yet our discussion. So I was looking, the next set of questions I think are of a slightly different character. We've got about 5 more minutes that I'd like to do in this first session of our interview. Is there anything you'd like to talk about at this point, sort of sum up our discussion so far?
No, I hope some things that we discuss later would be family. One of the things that I find very hurtful are when, I don't mind someone saying they don't understand or don't fully accept my gender identity, as long as they accept my right to have it and not to be discriminated against. I don't have a problem with it, but it makes me sad when they accept as gospel truth notions that we don't care about family, we don't, about our children, about our spouses. And that's not just trans people, that's LGBTQ people. And nothing could be further from the truth. Both speaking for myself, and then one of the things that's been a delight for me is I've gotten to know more people in the LGBTQ community in Asheville, is how absolutely ordinary they are when they're allowed to be. I mean, actually, if you let them alone and give them jobs, it's funny, they gravitate towards the same jobs that everyone else does. They want to go to the same picnics with their children. I mean, we have the same boring conversations, and they're not tinged with sexuality or any of that. And I wish that I'd like to see people understand more of that part of the story instead of just our identity and our story, which makes us sound very self-absorbed. When I was coming out, and I'll lead this towards a convenient closing point or pause point. I reached out by coincidence. I was living in New Jersey at the time, and I had read about this trans woman about my age now who was an executive in the Triangle Research Park. Is it Research Park, Research Triangle?
Research Triangle.
Research Triangle in North Carolina, and a very senior executive. And she seemed to sort of mirror the path that I was on, where she transitioned later and she held on to her corporate job. And I called her, and she was wonderful, generous with her time. And the wisest thing she said was, Tina, people think that we transition because we are obsessed with our gender and with gender. And they have it wrong. We actually transition so that for the first time in our lives, we can stop thinking about gender. And it's true. I don't mind. I feel like I'm an ambassador, so I'm not at all put out when people want to talk about that. But if society didn't talk about my gender, for the first time in my life, I wouldn't be thinking about it. I wouldn't be going, oh, I'm a woman going to work. I'd say, I'm Tina going to work. I'm Tina teaching this class. And they said, we transition so that we can finally stop thinking about it. And he said, it'll take you about 5 years, but you will get to the point where you just wake up and, like everyone else, women who are cis women, they don't wake up each day and go, oh, I'm a woman going to work. They say, no, I'm Judith or whatever my name is, and I'm a Republican or I'm a teacher. I mean, their identity is based on all the things that they share and do with society. Gender is actually something that's imposed with the set of expectations. And that's how I feel. I'm very happy and love who I am, but it isn't even close to the headline I want to leave on life. I care about what I've done for my children, I hope, for my community, for work. If I belong to a church, I'd care a lot about that. We could talk about that in part two. I think that's what people completely misunderstand, because it's society that's so focused on my gender identity and on that unique element. They're obsessed with it. If they would let go of that, they would learn all these other wonderful things about me that they would value. And some they might not. Some might not. Some people don't like my sense of humor. And that's what I ought to be judged on. Not this silly nonsense that we keep talking about. And we need to keep talking about it until people feel comfortable. Just as we need to, my neighbor across the street is Black, and she and I, we're on each other's porches all the time. And she just said to me last week, I'm so tired of talking about race. I wish we didn't have to do that. And I said, you're right, I'm tired too, but we have to. And she said, yeah, I guess so. Because we're just friends, and we wish we could just talk about recipes or other things. And I think it will be so nice when, as society, what we're really examining with all of these discussions aren't the ills of individuals or of classes. It's really the ills of society that we're discussing when we talk about gender, race, religion. The only reason they're an issue is because our society is rife with bigotry and prejudice. It has nothing to do with, in most cases, people's intersectionality, as you put it.
I think a better term, and maybe the term we can end on today, is in our next session, we're going to talk about our humanity.
Yes, yes. And if intersectionality gets us to that as a connecting point, I'm all for that. But yes, it's our humanity.
Tina, thank you for this first session. I've really enjoyed it. I'm going to stop recording in a moment, and
Great.
we will offline, we will set up the time for our next interview. So thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.